Now this evening we're going to discuss the mark of the beast and the seal of God. And to begin with, I would like to invite you to turn in your Bibles with me to the book of Revelation, chapter 13 and verse 16. Revelation chapter 13 and verse 16. Here it's speaking about the work of this second beast of Revelation 13. Now what does the second beast represent? It represents the United States. And what is the United States going to do? It's going to raise up an image to the sea beast. What must that mean? What was the main characteristic of the sea beast? During the 1260 years, it joined what? Joined church and state. In other words, the United States is going to repudiate its view that church and state should be separate. And it's going to make an image to and of that first beast. Believe it or not. It's going to repudiate the First Amendment of the Constitution, that Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And of course, we're told in the verse that we're going to read now that this second beast is also going to enforce the receiving of the mark of the beast. See, the image to the beast is different than the mark of the beast. Now, who is the beast that we've discussed here? Did we identify the beast? It's the Roman Catholic system, right? And the second beast is what? The United States. The image of the sea beast that the second beast makes is what? A replica of the system of government that the papacy had during the 1260 years. And now we want to talk about the mark of the beast. Now notice Revelation chapter 13 and verse 16. And he, that is the second beast, causeth all, both small and great, rich and poor, free and bond. I want you to remember those groups. Once again, small and great, rich and poor, free and bond, to receive a mark in their right hand or in their foreheads. What does this second beast do? He causes. What does that mean? He forces everyone to receive what? The mark of the beast in the right hand or in the what? In the forehead. Now I want you to notice that there is a contrasting sign to this one. A contrasting seal or mark. It's found in the very next chapter. Chapter 14 and verse 1. And I looked, and lo, a lamb stood on the Mount Zion, and with him 144,000, having his Father's name written in their foreheads. Now, did you catch the contrast between Revelation 13:16 and Revelation chapter 14 and verse 1? You have two marks that are placed where? On the forehead, or in the forehead, as it says in the King James Version. So we have two contrasting signs. We have the seal of God, and we have the mark of the beast. Now let's go also to Revelation chapter 6. Revelation chapter 6 and verse 15. This idea, this contrast, is also shown in the passage I'm going to read now. Revelation chapter 6 and verse 15. And the kings of the earth, and the great men, and the rich men, and the chief captains, and the mighty men, and every bondman, and every free man, hid themselves in the dens and in the rocks of the mountains, and said to the mountains and rocks, fall on us, and hide us from the face of him that sitteth on the throne, and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of his wrath is come, and who shall be able to stand? Are these those who are going to be lost when Jesus comes? By the way, did you notice the same terminology that is used to describe these people, bond and free, rich and poor, etc.? Is it the same group that we read about in Revelation 13 who received the mark of the beast? Same terminology is used. Two different descriptions of the same event. Now I want you to notice in the very next chapter, chapter 7, we have the contrasting group. It says in chapter 7 and verse 1, and after these things I saw four angels standing on the four corners of the earth, holding the four winds of the earth. I want you to remember these details. We're coming back to them. It says, and after these things I saw four angels standing on the four corners of the earth, holding the four winds of the earth, that the wind should not blow on the earth, nor on the sea, nor on any tree. And I saw another angel ascending from the east, having the seal of the living God. Is that in contrast to the individuals that we found in chapter 6? Yes. It says, I saw another angel ascending from the east, having the seal of the living God. And he cried with a loud voice to the four angels, to whom it was given to hurt the earth and the sea, saying, hurt not the earth. In other words, don't release the winds, neither the sea, nor the trees, till we have what? Till we have sealed the servants of our God in their foreheads. In other words, what this passage is saying is, don't release the winds, so that the cataclysmic events of the end of chapter 6 take place until we have had a chance to what? To seal the servants of God where? In their foreheads. So we have in Revelation two contrasting views of the saved and the lost. We have in Revelation 6 those who will cry for the rocks to fall upon them. Those are the ones who have the mark of the beast. We have, on the other hand, those who receive the seal of God, so that when the destruction comes, they will be preserved in the midst of the ruin. And then in Revelation chapter 13, we have those who receive the mark of the beast. In Revelation 14 and verse 1, we have those who receive the seal of God. Two contrasting groups. In other words, at the end of time, when Jesus comes, there are only going to be two groups in this world. Those who have the seal of God and those who have the mark of the beast. Those who have the seal of God will be saved, and those who have the mark of the beast will be what? Will be lost. Let me ask you then, how important is it to know what the mark of the beast and what the seal of God are? Is it a matter of life and death? Absolutely. By the way, if it's the mark of the beast, we would first of all have to know who the beast is, right? That's why we studied about the beast first. We know that the beast represents the Roman Catholic system. And so the Roman Catholic system must have a mark that the United States is going to what? Is going to enforce by law. And we need to understand what that mark is. Now, in order to understand the scene that we have, particularly in Revelation chapter 7, verses 1 to 3, we need to go back to the Old Testament. Most people cannot understand the book of Revelation because they don't go to the Old Testament, where most of the book of Revelation comes from. Now, we have to go back to the Old Testament to study the story of Israel right before the Babylonian captivity. And some of this will be reviewed because we studied this I believe it was last Wednesday evening, and also we continued a little bit on Sabbath morning. But let's go to the book of Ezekiel, and I'd like to say that Ezekiel chapter 1, we don't have time to deal with the chapter. I have a whole sermon that lasts about an hour just on the imagery of Ezekiel chapter 1. But if you read the chapter, you'll discover that God is coming in judgment upon Jerusalem. In other words, it is God who is coming from heaven, and he's coming to the Jerusalem temple, and he's going to judge Israel because Israel is in apostasy against God. In fact, we found in our study previously that God married Israel at Mount Sinai. Do you remember that? In Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 8, we're not going to read it, I'm just going to refer to some of these verses. In Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 8, God says that he married Israel. But then if you continue reading chapter 16, you'll discover that Israel became an unfaithful wife, an unfaithful bride. And she started playing what the Bible calls the harlot. Notice what we find in Ezekiel chapter 16 and verse 30. And this is just review. We studied this before. Ezekiel chapter 16 and verse 30 says, "How weak is thine heart, saith the Lord God, seeing thou doest all these things, the work of an imperious," you could also translate that, great, whorish woman. In other words, Israel, who was God's bride, God's wife, now has become unfaithful, and she's called the great what? She's called the great harlot, or the great whore, to use the terminology of the King James Version. Now, we also notice that Israel was committing terrible abominations. Do you remember we studied this? just to mention, Ezekiel 16 verse 2 mentions those abominations. All throughout Ezekiel 16 they're mentioned. Also in Ezekiel 16, it mentions Israel's fornication with the kings of the earth. We discovered that Israel is decked with gold and precious stones and pearls. We discovered also that Israel has daughters. We read it there in Ezekiel chapter 16 and chapter 23. In other words, she doesn't do her work alone. She does her work with her daughters. And of course, God names the worst abomination that's being committed among his people, among those who profess his name. We need to understand this, folks. Ezekiel 16 and 23 is not talking about the Philistines or the Babylonians or the Egyptians or the Assyrians. It's talking about those who profess to be God's people. We need to understand that, because this is going to be picked up in the book of Revelation. Now, the worst abomination was that Israel was worshiping the sun. Go with me to the book of Ezekiel. Actually, let's go to Ezekiel chapter 23 and verse 40 first of all, so we can read about the adornment of this harlot woman. Ezekiel chapter 23 verse 40, it says, "And furthermore, that ye have sent for men to come from afar, unto whom a messenger was sent, and lo, they came, for whom thou didst wash thyself, paintest thy eyes, and deckest thyself with ornaments." See, very, very similar to what we find in Revelation chapter 17. Now let's notice Ezekiel chapter 8. By the way, all of these chapters are describing the apostasy of Israel before the Babylonian captivity. Ezekiel chapter 8 and verses 16 and 17. And by the way, chapter 8 is called the abominations chapter, because God shows Ezekiel an abomination that's being committed among his people. And Ezekiel says, "Wow, Lord, that's terrible." God says, "You haven't seen anything yet. I'm going to show you one worse than that." And then God shows him a worse abomination. And Ezekiel says, "There can't be anything worse than that." God says, "You haven't seen anything yet. I'm going to show you a worse abomination yet." And I want you to notice what is at the very top of the list. Number one, the greatest abomination, according to Ezekiel chapter 8 and verse 16. "And he brought me into the inner court of the Lord's house, and behold, at the door of the temple of the Lord, between the porch and the altar, were about 25 men with their backs toward the temple of the Lord, and their faces toward the east, and they worshiped the sun toward the east. Then he said unto me, Hast thou seen this, O son of man? Is it a light thing to the house of Judah that they commit the abomination which they commit here?" Notice that worshiping the sun is called a what? It's called an abomination, according to this. It is the worst abomination. Do you know why? Because by worshiping the sun, they were trampling on God as the creator. They were really claiming that Baal was their creator. You see, at issue in worshiping the sun was a failure to recognize God as the creator. We need to understand that. In other words, by worshiping the sun, they were rejecting God the creator. In fact, we noticed in our study that Jerusalem was filled with the blood of God's people. Interestingly enough. In other words, Jerusalem had become a harlot that was shedding the blood of God's innocent people. You can read that in Ezekiel 16 and verse 45. Now, because of this terrible condition among God's people, among those who claimed to serve the true God, but were actually worshiping the sun god, God said, "I am going to come in judgment against this people." Now, I want you to notice in Ezekiel chapter 7, verses 1 and 2, where the judgment is coming from. Ezekiel 7, verses 1 and 2. "Moreover, the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Also, thou son of man, thus saith the Lord God unto the land of Israel, An end, the end is come upon the four corners of the land." Now, do you remember reading something about four corners in Revelation chapter 7? That there were four angels at the four corners holding the winds, and when they release the winds, what comes? Destruction. Here God is saying that destruction is coming upon what? The four corners of the land. A definite connection between Ezekiel and the book of Revelation. But before God comes in judgment against Israel, those who claim to serve him, who are really committing abominations, fornications, shedding innocent blood, dominating the multitudes and the peoples, being unfaithful to God, playing the harlot, before God comes in judgment and in punishment against them, there's a work that needs to be performed. And that work is described in Ezekiel chapter 9 and verses 1 through 6. I want you to notice, destruction is coming from upon the four angles of the land because of the apostasy among God's people. His faithful wife has become a harlot. And now God says, I'm going to punish Israel, I'm going to come in judgment. But before he destroys Israel, before he destroys Jerusalem, there's a work that has to be performed, because not everybody in Jerusalem was unfaithful to God. God has to separate a people. And I want you to notice what he does. Ezekiel chapter 9 and verse 1. He cried also in mine ears with a loud voice, saying, cause them that have charge over the city to draw near, even every man with his destroying weapon in his hand. By the way, these are angels. And behold, 6 men came from the way of the higher gate, which lieth toward the north, and every man a slaughter weapon in his hand. And one man among them was clothed with linen. Do you remember in Revelation chapter 7, there was one who rose from came from the rising sun, and he had the seal of the living God in his hand? Now notice how this is described. It says, and one man among them was clothed with linen. By the way, do you know who was clothed with linen in the Hebrew sanctuary? It was the high priest. And do you know when he was clothed with linen? On the Day of Atonement, the great judgment day of Israel. And so it says that he has what? A writer's inkhorn by his side. And they went in and stood beside the brazen altar. And the glory of the God of Israel was gone up from the cherub, whereupon he was, to the threshold of the house. And he called to the man clothed with linen, which had the writer's inkhorn by his side. By the way, was there a voice in Revelation chapter 7 that says, don't let loose the winds, don't destroy the earth, don't destroy any plant, don't cause any destruction on the earth till we have sealed God's servants on their foreheads? Did we find that in Revelation? Absolutely. Now we're going to find the same thing here. And he called to the man clothed with linen, which had the writer's inkhorn by his side. And the Lord said unto him, go through the midst of the city. Through the midst of what? Of where? Jerusalem. This isn't talking about God going to some apostate nation to punish them. He is going to perform this work of judgment among his own professed people. Very important detail. And so it says, and the Lord said unto him, go through the midst of the city, through the midst of Jerusalem, and set a mark upon the what? And set a mark upon the foreheads of the men that sigh and that cry for all the abominations that be done in the midst thereof. Was everyone in Jerusalem in apostasy? No. Was there a group who sighed and cried because of the abominations which were being committed among those who professed to be God's people? Absolutely. Verse 5, and to the others he said in mine hearing, go ye after him. That is, after the sealing is finished. Go ye after him through the city, and smite. Let not your eye spare, neither have ye pity. Remember those expressions. We're coming back to them. Slay utterly, old and young, both maids and little children and women. But come not near any man upon whom is the mark. And begin with the Egyptians. No, it says begin at my what? Sanctuary, among the religious leaders. In other words, then they began at the ancient men which were before the house. Are you catching the picture? Israel is in a terrible apostasy, committing abominations, fornications, shedding innocent blood, trampling upon God's people, playing the harlot. And God says, I'm coming in judgment upon the four corners of the land. But before I do, there's a work of sealing that needs to be performed, because in the city there are faithful people. And the faithful people have to have this sign of protection so that when the destruction comes, they are spared from the destruction. Now, what happened when God finished his work of judgment? We find a description of the end of this work of judgment when everybody was sealed in Ezekiel chapter 11 and verses 22 and 23. Ezekiel chapter 11, 22 and 23. Do you know what happened? When God finished separating all of the righteous from the wicked, the Bible tells us that the glory that was in the temple departed from the temple, and Jerusalem had been forsaken. And now she was desolate. The enemy would come to destroy her. Notice Ezekiel chapter 11 and verses 22 and 23. Then did the cherubims lift up their wings, and the wheels beside them, and the glory of the God of Israel was over them above. And the glory of the Lord went up from the midst of the city, and stood upon the mountain which is on the east side of the city. That is the Mount of Olives. And then if you continue reading, it says that the glory of God, the presence of God, forsook the city of Jerusalem. And now Jerusalem, with the exception of those who had the seal of God, were desolate and were open for destruction. Now, what historical event fulfilled the destruction of Jerusalem? The fact is, folks, that after the sealing, there came a terrible time of crisis for Jerusalem. In fact, it was a horrendous, bitter time of trouble. Have any of you ever read the book of Lamentations? You know, it's a book that we don't read very much. It was written by Jeremiah. Do you know when Jeremiah wrote that book? He wrote it as the Israelites were being taken captive to Babylon. It's really a funeral dirge. You know, if you look at the style of writing, the literature, it is a funeral dirge in what is called in Hebrew, kina meter. In other words, it's written for people who are in a funeral procession because Israel has been decimated by the Babylonians. And you can read there, the time that Israel was surrounded by Nebuchadnezzar and his armies, the hunger became so bad in the city of Jerusalem that Lamentation says that mothers ate their own children. I mean, how hungry do you become when you have to eat your own children? It was terrible. Insurrection, sword, crime in Jerusalem after the glory of God left. And then, of course, Nebuchadnezzar breached the walls of the city. And he came in. And I want you to notice what he did. 2 Chronicles chapter 36, which is the historical account of this. 2 Chronicles chapter 36 and verse 17. 36:17. It says, therefore he brought upon them, that is upon Jerusalem, the king of the Chaldees, who slew their young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary. Is this fulfilling what we read in Ezekiel 9? Remember? Don't spare young or old, maiden, etc. Destroy them. Here it says, therefore he brought upon them the king of the Chaldees, who slew their young men with a sword in the house of their sanctuary, and had no compassion upon young man or maiden, old man or him that stooped for age. He gave them all into his hand. And Jerusalem was destroyed, and Israel was taken captive. Why? Because they were committing what? Abominations. The greatest abomination was what? Worshiping the sun. By the way, would they have worshiped the sun if they had been keeping the Sabbath? Do you know something interesting? Several times in the Old Testament, God explains that the reason why Israel went into captivity is because they broke God's Sabbath. In fact, let's read one of those verses in Jeremiah chapter 17 and verse 27. Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 27. And by the way, Jeremiah is writing in the same time frame before the destruction of Jerusalem. It says there in Jeremiah chapter 17 and verse 27, God speaking to Israel, but if ye will not hearken unto me to hallow the Sabbath day, that is to make the Sabbath day holy, and not to bear a burden, even entering in at the gates of Jerusalem on the Sabbath day, what will God do? Then will I kindle a fire in the gates thereof, and it shall devour the palaces of Jerusalem, and it shall not be quenched. Is that exactly what Nebuchadnezzar did? Did he enter and burn the city and destroy the city and take God's people captive and destroy with the sword? He most certainly did. According to Jeremiah, why did Nebuchadnezzar do this? Because Israel was not keeping what? Was not keeping God's holy Sabbath. They were not recognizing God as the creator. They were worshiping the sun god, Baal. Now, I want you to notice also Ezekiel chapter 20. Ezekiel chapter 20 and verse 20. It speaks about the rebellion of Israel in the wilderness. You know, Israel was constantly rebellious in the wilderness. and she was rebellious when she entered the land of Canaan. I want you to notice in Ezekiel chapter 20 what God gave Israel to protect them from rebellion. It says in Ezekiel chapter 20 and verse 20 the following. Ezekiel chapter 20 and verse 20. And hallow my Sabbaths, that is, sanctify my Sabbaths, and they shall be a what? A sign between me and you, that ye may know that I am the Lord your God. What was the purpose of the Sabbath? To remind Israel that they had how many gods? That only the Lord was their God. Notice also verse 12, Ezekiel chapter 20 and verse 12. It says, moreover, also I gave them my Sabbaths to be a sign between me and them, that they might know that I am the Lord that sanctify them. Would they have forgotten God and worshiped the sun god if they had been recognizing God as their creator by observing the holy Sabbath? No, because time and again in the Old Testament, it is clear that God gave Israel the Sabbath so that they would remember that He was the only true God. They would have never fallen into idolatry if they had observed the Sabbath. In fact, Jeremiah 17:27 says that the city would have never been destroyed if they had not been breaking God's holy Sabbath. Now, who was to blame for the unfaithfulness of Israel? Very important question. Who was to blame for the unfaithfulness of Israel? Let's go to the book of Jeremiah chapter 5 and verses 30 and 31. Of course, they were to blame, but there were some people that actually encouraged them in their apostasy. Jeremiah chapter 5 and verses 30 and 31. Here it says, a wonderful and horrible thing is committed in the land. We just read about it in Ezekiel. The prophets prophesy falsely, and the priests bear rule by their means. Where was the problem with the prophets and the what? And the priests. Were the people to blame also? Sure, notice. And my people love to have it so. And what will ye do in the end thereof? Notice also Jeremiah chapter 2 and verse 8. Same idea coming through. And you can read the first few chapters of Jeremiah, the first 10 chapters of Ezekiel. You'll find the same thing. Notice Jeremiah chapter 2 and verse 8. The priests said not, where is the Lord? And they that handle the law knew me not. The pastors also transgressed against me, and the prophets prophesied by Baal and walked after things that do not profit. Once again, who is targeted particularly for the apostasy of Israel? It is the priests, the prophets, the pastors who led Israel astray. Now, how many groups were there in Jerusalem? There were two groups. One group was the group that was worshiping the what? The sun. The other group were those who were sighing and crying because of the abominations, particularly the worshiping of the sun that was being committed where? That was being committed in Jerusalem. Are you understanding the scenario that we have in the Old Testament? This is speaking about Israel, isn't it? God's chosen people. Those who claim to serve the true God. Do you know that this whole scenario of the Old Testament is actually transported into the book of Revelation? Let me ask you, did Jesus marry the church when he was on this earth, particularly on the day of Pentecost? Did he? Husbands, love your wives, even as Christ what? Loved the church. Did the church, according to Revelation chapter 2 and 3, after a good beginning, apostatize from God and begin playing the harlot? Yes, she did. In fact, the fourth church of Revelation is the church of Thyatira. Almost every biblical expositor, conservative biblical expositor, says that the church of Thyatira is the church of the Middle Ages. Not only Seventh-day Adventist expositors, but non-Seventh-day Adventist expositors, like even Tim LaHaye, with whom I almost totally agree on his views of Bible prophecy. But he got that right. He says that the church of Thyatira, the fourth church, represents the period of the Middle Ages. Do you know who was involved in the church during that time? It says, you allow that woman Jezebel to entice my servants to be unfaithful to me. Well, by this time, Jezebel was long dead and buried and disintegrated. But it was a church similar to what Jezebel had done in the Old Testament. The church had become a what? Had become a harlot. Go with me to Revelation 17 quickly. Revelation chapter 17. We've studied this before, but now we have to come back to it again because it has a very close relationship with what we're discussing tonight. You know, most Christians today say, well, the big battle at the end of time is going to be between Christians and non-Christians, secular humanists and people who practice Christianity. You think that's true? You know, it's a sobering fact, folks, to realize that those who professed to be children of the true God were totally unprepared for the first coming of Jesus. He came to his own, and his own received him not. And do you know why? Because they were misinterpreting Bible prophecy, the prophecies of the Old Testament. Of course, right before the second coming, that's never going to happen again because the devil's all tied up. Do you think? Do you think that it's just perhaps possible that the majority of the Christian world at the end of time is going to be as deceived about Bible prophecy as the Jews were before the second coming of Jesus? There's no doubt whatsoever about it. And yet thinking themselves to be the favored ones of God, the faithful ones of God, and that prophecy is fulfilling with those hated Romans over there, so to speak. Are you understanding what I'm saying? Now go with me to Revelation 17, verse 1. We've read this before, but we're going to read it again now. Do we have the same elements that we found in Ezekiel? Do we have a harlot? Yes. Do we have abominations? Yes. Do we have fornication? Yes. Do we have this woman filled with the blood of the saints? Yes. Is she controlling the nations? Yes. Is she decked with gold and silver and precious stones? Yes. But of course, this harlot woman must be the Muslims. Now, what's your principle? What's your principle in saying that? Reading the newspapers. Yeah, that's right. That's called interpreting prophecy by the newspapers. But you see, we have to interpret prophecy by the Bible. You can't understand Revelation without understanding the Old Testament background. See, it's God's people who are constantly in apostasy against God. Now, I want you to notice, I'm going to read Revelation 17, 1-5. And there came one of the seven angels which had the seven vials, and talked with me, saying unto me, Come hither, I will show unto thee the judgment of the great whore that sitteth upon many waters. So you have a whore again, great whore, even as in Ezekiel, with whom the kings of the earth have committed fornication. See, there's fornication. And the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication. We've already talked about the wine. It's her false doctrines. It's the doctrines that are contrary to the first angel's message. She must teach that the law of God is no longer binding, that you don't have to keep the Sabbath, that the dead aren't dead. Remember we studied all of this? The wine of Babylon is the opposite of the first angel's message. Verse 3, So he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-colored beast, full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And the woman, notice, was arrayed in purple and scarlet color, and decked with gold and precious stones and pearls. Did we see this in the Old Testament? Yes. And it says, having a golden cup in her hand. Even this was in the Old Testament. You can read it in Jeremiah 51 and verse 7. Having a golden cup in her hand, full of what? Same word, abominations and filthiness of her fornication. And upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the what? The mother of harlots. If she's the mother, must she have daughters? Must she have an image of herself? Must she have a false prophet, so to speak? Yes, absolutely. See, all of those symbols are the same. False prophet, image, daughters are the same thing. And we have to refer once again to the story of Elijah. Remember the story of Elijah? You have a wicked king. You have an evil harlot who uses the king. But she can't use the king unless she has an apostate, false priesthood to help her, which are the false prophets of Baal. See, there you have false prophets, harlot, and king. In the days of John the Baptist, the same thing. By the way, we're dealing here with Elijah. In the end time, God is going to raise up an Elijah movement that will preach the same message as Elijah. See, with John the Baptist, the same thing. You have a wicked king, Herod. And you have a harlot woman, an adulterous woman, Herodias. And Herodias wants to see John the Baptist dead. She can't do anything to him unless she uses the king. And in order to get the king, she has to use her what? Daughter. Do you see, in the Old Testament, it's the false prophets of Baal. In the New Testament, it's the daughter. False prophets, daughter are the same thing. Raise your hand if you're understanding what I'm saying. See, you have to let both testaments explain one another. Now, how many parts does Babylon have? Babylon has 3 parts. What is the first part? The dragon. Dragon is Satan, but it represents also the civil powers that he uses to fulfill his purposes. Because Rome was stood next to Christ to try and devour him. It wasn't Satan directly, he used the civil power. Then he used the civil power to also lead Jesus to the cross. And then, of course, you have the beast. What does the beast represent? The papacy. And then you have the false prophet. What does the false prophet represent? The false prophet does everything that the beast says. Helps the beast get the power of the state back, doesn't he? He was wounded by the sword, but now the second beast helped the first beast get his power back. Amazing. You say, it's impossible that could happen in the United States. Well, it's not impossible because God says that it's going to happen in Holy Scripture. Now let me ask you, is there going to be a group that is going to sighing and crying because of the abominations that are taking place in Babylon? Do you know where that sighing and crying is? It's in Revelation chapter 18, verse 1. See, we're going over the same groundwork as in the Old Testament. It says in Revelation chapter 18, verse 1, "And after these things I saw another angel come down from heaven, having great power, and the earth was lightened with his glory. And he cried mightily with a strong voice." See, these are those who are sighing and crying because of the abominations of Babylon. It says, "Babylon the great is fallen, and has become the habitation of devils, and the hole of every foul spirit, and a cage of every unclean and hateful bird." Who is this angel that's crying out? Is this some angel that's going to whiz through heaven? No. He represents whom? Those who are faithful to God and cannot stand the abominations that are being committed in Babylon. This represents a group of people who cry out because of the abominations that are being committed by this harlot and by her daughters. Verse 3, "For all nations have drunk of the wine of the wrath of her fornication, and the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth are waxed rich through the abundance of her delicacies." And this is the part I like now, verse 4, "And I heard another voice from heaven saying, 'Come out of her, my people.'" Does God have people in Babylon? Yes. Does he have people among the political rulers of the world that are his? Yes. Does he have people in the Roman Catholic system that are his? That are true children of God? Yes. Does he have individuals in the Protestant churches that are his, that are faithful to God? They live up to all of the light that they have? Absolutely yes. Seventh-day Adventist Church doesn't believe that the only true children of God are in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We believe that most of God's people are outside the Seventh-day Adventist Church. But God does what? God calls them out of Babylon because of her fornications and because of her abominations. So the question is, how many groups are there going to be at the end of time? Those who are participating in the abominations of Babylon, and those who are presenting this message, sighing and crying because of the abominations that are being committed among God's professed people. Now we need to ask the question, what is the seal of God? Well, it can be determined from several perspectives. And I want to share these perspectives with you, and then, of course, we're going to talk about the mark of the beast. First of all, let's talk about the first angel's message. Does the first angel's message call us to keep God's holy law? Remember, fear God and keep his commandments? Ecclesiastes 12, in Revelation it says, fear God and what? Give glory to him. So does the first angel call us to keep God's commandments? Yes. Does the first angel's message call us to worship the Creator by keeping his holy Sabbath? Yes. So the first angel's message calls God's people to do two things. One, to keep God's holy law. And in the second place, to worship the Creator, God. And you can't claim to worship the Creator God unless you are keeping His Sabbath, which is the sign of the Creator. Now, have you all ever noticed the contrast of the third angel's message? The third angel's message says, if anyone worships the what? The beast or his image. Would that happen to mean that people are trampling upon the true Creator? Yes. And upon His holy Sabbath? Yes. So is the issue worship? Worshiping the Creator or worshiping the beast? Absolutely. And by the way, the third angel's message ends by saying, here are they who keep the commandments of God. So the first angel's message calls God's people to keep the commandments and to worship the Creator. That must mean that in the third angel's message, the beast counterfeits the work of the Creator, and it must mean that he tramples upon the holy law of God. Because the first and third angel's message are in contrast. Now I want you to remember also the contrast that we have in Ezekiel 8 verse 16 and Ezekiel chapter 9. I don't know whether you noticed this, I didn't underline it, but I'm going to underline it now. One group in Ezekiel chapter 8 and verse 16 is worshiping the what? The sun. And immediately in the next chapter are those who have what on their foreheads? The seal of God. Are you with me or not? So what is the contrast here? It's the contrast between those who worship the sun and those who have the seal of God. So must the mark of the beast have something to do with the sun. In contrast to those who have the seal of God. If you look at Ezekiel, absolutely. Now go with me to Deuteronomy chapter 6. Deuteronomy chapter 6, some additional evidence here. Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 5, first of all. Deuteronomy chapter 6 and verse 5. And thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thine heart and with all thy soul and with all thy might. What table of the law is that verse dealing with? It's dealing with the first table of the law. Now what does God tell us to do? What did God tell Israel to do with this table of the law? Notice verse 8. It says in verse 8, and thou shalt what? Bind them for a sign upon thine hand, and they shall be as what? As frontlets between thine eyes. Does the seal on the forehead have anything to do with God's commandments, particularly with the first table of the law? In context, yes. It definitely has a relationship with the first table of the law, which calls us, by the way, to have no other gods, to make no images of God, to not take God's name in vain, and to keep His holy what? And to keep His holy Sabbath. Notice also Isaiah chapter 8. Constantly in the Bible, the law is identified with the forehead, with sealing. Notice what we find in Isaiah chapter 8 and verse 16. It says there, very short verse, bind up the testimony, seal the what? Seal the law among my disciples. Notice once again the idea of sealing the what? The law among God's disciples. Notice also Hebrews chapter 10. Same idea coming through time and again. Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 16. This is a verse that is quoted actually from the Old Testament. And it says there in Hebrews chapter 10 and verse 16, this is the covenant, speaking about the new covenant, this is the covenant that I will make with them after those days, saith the Lord. I will put my laws into their hearts, and what? And in their minds will I what? Will I write them. Where is God going to write His law? In the mind. Where is your mind? Has to do with your brain. Where's your brain? It's behind your what? your forehead. Seal my law among my disciples. God will take his law and he will write it where? He will write it in our minds. God says you shall bind this first table of the law where? These commandments. Bind it as frontlets between your eyes. In Ezekiel chapter 8, God contrasts those who worship the sun god with those who receive the seal of God. Are you starting to catch a picture? He contrasts, by the way, those who receive the first angel's message to worship the Creator and those who worship the beast, who must be a counterfeit of the Creator. Are you understanding me? And incidentally, time and again in the book of Revelation, we find the idea that the devil is enraged against those who keep the commandments of God. Don't we have that? For example, Revelation 12:17. The dragon was enraged with the woman. What does a woman represent? The church. How many women do we have in Revelation? Oh, 2. We got 2. Yeah, we have 2 women. The one in Revelation 12, is she pure or impure? She's the pure church. By the way, have you ever noticed in Revelation chapter 12 that the true church during the 1260 years was the church that was fleeing and was in exile? Have you caught that? It says that the woman fled into the what? Into the wilderness for 1,260 days, which are years. Who did she flee from? She fled from the other woman. So how many churches were there during the Middle Ages? There were 2 churches. There was the persecuted church and the persecuting church. Are you with me? And what characteristics does the pure woman or the pure bride of Jesus have? What enrages the devil? Oh, it says in Revelation 12, verse 17, that the dragon was wroth with the woman and went to make war with the remnant of her seed, who what? Who keep the commandments of God and have the what? And have the testimony of Jesus Christ, which we have a whole lecture where we're going to deal with the testimony of Jesus Christ. Does the devil hate the law? He most certainly does. And now let me share a little tidbit with you here, very interesting little tidbit. Remember that we said that Revelation chapter 12 is parallel to Revelation 13? They both begin in the Old Testament. Then you have Rome when the child is born in Revelation 12, and you have the dragon beast in Revelation 13. Then the woman flees to the wilderness for 1,260 years, Revelation 13. The church is persecuted for 42 months. Remember that? And then in Revelation chapter 12, the earth helps the woman, right? Are you with me or not? The earth helps the woman. In Revelation chapter 13, the beast receives a what? A deadly wound. See? Help from both sides. And then it says that the deadly wound is healed. And the United States speaks as a what? As a dragon. That's in Revelation chapter 13, right? In Revelation 12, it says that after the earth helps the woman, the dragon is enraged with the woman and goes to make war with the remnant of her seed who keep the commandments of God. So what I'm trying to say is this. In Revelation 12, the final stage of persecution of the dragon against the woman is because she keeps the commandments of God and she has the testimony of Jesus. If Revelation 13 is parallel to Revelation 12, which it is, then let me ask you something. Would you expect to find the 2 characteristics that the devil hates also in Revelation 13? Yes? Of course. What do you suppose the devil hates? Which commandment do you suppose the devil hates more than any other commandment? He's going to enforce the mark of the beast because he wants to counteract the seal of God. And by the way, how does he counteract the testimony of Jesus? We'll deal with this a little bit later on. I'm throwing out the idea now. The way in which he tries to counteract the testimony of Jesus, which is identified in Revelation 19 as the spirit of prophecy, is by raising up a what? A false prophet. In other words, the true remnant church is going to keep the commandments of God. Revelation 13 says that they're even going to have the seal of God in contrast to the mark of the beast. There's one commandment which is particularly at issue. And Revelation chapter 12 says that they will have the testimony of Jesus, they will have the gift of prophecy to counteract the work of the false prophet. Are you understanding what I'm saying? Now, you know what's really interesting is that in antiquity, in the Middle East, covenants were written in a very peculiar way. And I'm going to share this with you very quickly. In the PowerPoint presentation that you're going to get, you're going to have several pictures of what I'm going to describe now. The same geographical region where God gave the Ten Commandments, around the same historical time frame, we know how they wrote covenants. How a great king would make a covenant with a lesser king. What he would do is they would take a tablet and he would write on the tablet the covenant between him, the great king, and the lesser king. And interestingly enough, the tablet was written on both sides. It was written on the front side and the back side. The same material was written on both sides. Besides that, the covenant was written, as I mentioned, on tablets. In the middle of the tablet, and there's several illustrations that you're going to have on the PowerPoint, in the middle of the tablet, when the clay was soft, they impressed the seal of the king who was making the covenant. And that's the reason why they wrote the covenant on both sides. Because when they impressed the seal in the middle of the writing on the first side, where the seal was impressed, the writing was obliterated. So what they would do is they would turn the tablet around and they would read the whole document on the obverse side. Do you know what the seal invariably had? Had three things. It had the name of the great king who was making the covenant. It had the territory over which he governed. And it had his official title. For example, one of them was King Nikmadu, king of Ugarit, on one of those tablets. In other words, the seal had the purpose of identifying, first of all, the name of the king, his territory, and his office as king of a certain realm. Now let me ask you, if the Ten Commandments were written around this same time period, would you expect the Ten Commandments to share those characteristics? Are the Ten Commandments written on tablets? Were they written on tablets? Yes. Were the Ten Commandments a covenant? God's covenant with his people? Yes. After God gave the Ten Commandments, Israel says, all that the Lord has said, we will what? We will do. Were the Ten Commandments written on both sides of the tablets? That's a detail that many people don't know. Exodus 32, verses 15 and 16 say that the Ten Commandments were written on both sides. On the front side and on the back side. Now let me ask you, where would you expect to find the seal of God in his law, in the tablet? Where would you expect to find it? You would expect to find it right in the center of the law. And what must that seal have? It must have the name, the office, and the territory over which the giver of the law governs. Do you know that there's only one commandment in the law of God, which is in the very center of the law of God, that has those three characteristics? Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shall you labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. Let me ask you, is his name in there? Yes. And then at the end of the passage it says, for in 6 days the Lord what? Created. What is his office? What's his territory? He created what? The heavens, the earth, the seas, and all that in them is. It's the only commandment that has all three necessary elements of a covenant. You see, many times when this message is presented, you know, evangelists will use the seal of the President of the United States. And they'll say, yeah, the President of the United States, you know, his seal has George W. Bush, President, United States. They say, a seal has to have the three elements. And that's fine, except that the seal of George Bush is 3,500 years removed from the Ten Commandments. But when you see that archaeology proves that the seal was placed with those characteristics in the Old Testament when the Ten Commandments were given, it becomes much more powerful. Because you realize that God has a seal in his law. And that seal is the holy what? The holy Sabbath. It's the commandment that the devil hates the most. Why does the devil hate it? Because it is the commandment that identifies God as the what? As the only true God and as the creator of the heavens and the earth. Now let me ask you, what then would the mark of the beast be? We're dealing with opposites here. The mark of the beast must represent an opposite day of worship. Are you following me or not? Yes. Is this making sense to you? It must be an opposite day. Must it have something to do with the sun? Remember in Ezekiel chapter 8? Same scene in Revelation 7, right? The angel comes with the seal. Is it just possible that God's people are worshiping not the sun, but they're worshiping on the day of the sun? You say, well, it's not the same thing, Pastor. Yes, it is. Excuse me for being so blunt. I've never been known for political correctness. I mentioned this on Sabbath morning. Who made the sun? God did. Did he make it for worship? So what happens if you convert it or make it into an object of worship? What do you call that? You call it idolatry. Who made the first day of the week? God did. Did he make it for worship? You show me a verse in the Bible where it says that he made it. Oh, but Jesus resurrected that day. So? Where did Jesus say we're supposed to keep that day in honor of his resurrection? Nowhere. It's a human assumption. When the Bible says from Genesis to Revelation that we're supposed to keep the Sabbath in honor of the Creator. Are you understanding me? This is a vital issue. So who made the first day of the week? God did. Did he make it for worship? No. So what happens if you convert it into a day of worship? It's idolatry. It doesn't matter whether it's an object. It doesn't matter whether it's a day. Anything that you make for worship that God did not make for worship is what? Is idolatry. And there's many idolaters that don't know any better. And God will wink at their ignorance if they didn't have a chance to know. But he will hold us responsible if we know. By the way, do you remember that we read Daniel 7 verse 25 where it says that the little horn, who is the same as the beast, right? Remember that? The little horn is the same as the beast, remember? Governs time, times, the dividing of time. What did the little horn think he could do? He thought he could change what? He thought he could change the times, we'll deal with that later on, and what else? And the law. Has the Roman Catholic Church claimed to change God's law? Let me read you just a few statements here, very quickly. J.F. Snyder, in 1895, wrote to Cardinal Gibbons, James Cardinal Gibbons, and asked him whether it was true that the Sabbath was the day of rest. And this is the question. Does the Roman Catholic Church claim the act of changing the observance of the Sabbath from the 7th to the first day of the week as a mark of her power? Does the Roman Catholic Church say that this is a sign or a mark of her power? Here's the answer from Chancellor H.F. Thomas, who was the Chancellor of Cardinal Gibbons. Of course the Catholic Church claims that the change was her act. It could not have been otherwise, as none in those days would have dreamed of doing anything in matters spiritual and ecclesiastical and religious without her. And the act is a mark of her ecclesiastical power and authority in religious matters. A mark. The very word is used. September 1, 1923, the Catholic Record, Roman Catholic publication. You have this statement. Sunday is our mark of authority. This is a Roman Catholic source. Sunday is our mark of authority. The church is above the Bible, and this transference of Sabbath observance is proof of that fact. Convert's Catechism, which was written by Peter Geierman. Question, which is the Sabbath day? Answer, Saturday is the Sabbath day. Question, why do we observe Sunday instead of Saturday? Answer, we observe Sunday instead of Saturday because the Catholic Church in the Council of Laodicea transferred the solemnity from Saturday to Sunday. Here's another statement from Pope John the 22nd. He, that is the Pope, alone promulgates the law. He alone is absolved from all law. He alone sits in the chair of St. Peter, not as a mere man, but as man and God. His will is law. What he pleases has the force of law. This is from Millman's History of Latin Christianity. There are many other quotations I could read. I have about 15 pages of them from Roman Catholic sources. Notice this one. This is by Father Enright, longtime president of Redemptorist College of America. He says it was the Holy Catholic Church that changed the day of rest from Saturday to Sunday, the first day of the week. And it not only compelled all to keep Sunday, but urged all persons to labor on the seventh day under pain of anathema. Protestants profess great reverence for the Bible, and yet by their solemn act of keeping Sunday, they acknowledge the power of the Catholic Church. The Bible says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. But the Catholic Church says, no, keep the first day of the week. And lo, the entire civilized world bows down in reverent obedience to the command of the Holy Catholic Church. Bows down in reverent obedience. Everyone will worship the what? The beast. I wish I had time to read more. I wish I had time to talk to you about the latest papal pastoral letter which he wrote called Dies Domini, the Day of the Lord, or the Lord's Day, where Pope John Paul II is much more diplomatic, but I'll just share with you, he calls Sunday the Church's precept. That's paragraph 18. Paragraph 27, he says that Sunday was established through Christian reflection and pastoral practice and wise pastoral intuition. In paragraph 63, he says, Christians felt they had the authority to transfer Sabbath to Sunday. Paragraph 81, he says, the spiritual and pastoral riches of Sunday as it has been handed down to us by tradition. See, he's much more diplomatic, but he still says the same thing. And that is that the Roman Catholic Church has changed the day from Sabbath to Sunday, and this is the mark of her authority. What human being has the right to change God's holy law? Do you understand what the mark of the beast is? The law of God has been chiseled. Fourth commandment has been removed. And instead, the first day of the week has been placed as a day of worship, without any "thus saith the Lord." And the sad thing is, the United States of America is going to make an image of this sea beast. And it's happening now. Things are happening in the United States right now that is forming a close relationship between the papacy and the United States, and the blending of church and state. You see, making an image to the beast means, and an image of the beast, means establishing a system like existed in Europe, where the church controls the state for the state to enforce her religion. That's an image. It's a likeness. And of course, the United States is going not only to make an image of and to the beast, it's going to enforce the mark of the beast. Nobody in the world has the mark of the beast yet. Praise the Lord for that. But when people know the issues in the very end time, and they choose to keep the first day of the week, in spite of knowing what the Bible has to teach about this, at that moment they will receive the mark of the beast. And what will happen to them? The same thing that happened to Israel after the sealing. They will be left in this world without any refuge. And that's why I'm telling you these things. I'm not trying to scare you into serving God. Because ultimately, it doesn't do any good to keep the Sabbath because you're afraid. You want to keep the Sabbath because you love Jesus. You want to spend that time with Jesus. That's what the Sabbath is all about. You know, it's not just a legal precept. You better keep it or you're going to go to hell. That's totally false. You see, you want to keep the Sabbath because you love Jesus, because you want to obey Jesus, because you want to enhance your relationship with Jesus. And if you say, no, Jesus, well, that's like slapping him in the face. By the way, let me just mention here in passing something very important. The mark of the beast is received in the right hand or in the forehead, whereas the seal of God is received only in the forehead. Do you know what the hand represents in the Bible? It represents work. You can read, for example, Ecclesiastes 9 and verse 10. All you have to do with your hand. See? We work with our hand. What do we do with our mind? We think with our mind, right? Do you know those who worship the beast? Some are going to worship the beast because they really believe, they really are deceived that the beast is right. Their mind is totally given over to the beast. There will be others that in order to work, in order to carry on their activities, they will receive the mark of the beast because they're afraid of not being able to buy and sell. And they will receive it even though they know that the beast is wrong. It's the same type of relationship between those two groups and the sin of Adam and Eve. Let me ask you, was Eve deceived by the serpent? Yeah, did she swallow the bait and the hook and the sinker and even the fishing pole? Didn't she? She was deceived. She believed the serpent. Did Adam believe the serpent? No, he could not live without his beloved Eve. He sinned out of convenience, though he knew that Eve had done wrong. There's going to be two types of people. But do you know God will only have one type of person at the end of time? Not those who serve him out of convenience, only those whose mind is given over totally and completely to him. Exodus 31 verse 16 tells us that the Sabbath is a sign, a perpetual sign between God and Israel. Children of Israel. You say, well, that's the children of Israel. Do you know what Galatians chapter 3 verse 29 says? If ye are Christ's, then you are what? Abraham's seed. So what makes us Israel? The blood we have in our veins? Our last name? The place we live? No, if you are Christ's, you are Abraham's seed. We are Israel if we belong to Christ. And if the Sabbath was for Israel perpetually, and we are Israel, is the Sabbath for us? The Sabbath is definitely for us. We have to make a choice whether we are going to belong to the harlot or whether we are going to belong to God's true church. That's a choice that we have to make. We can't stay on the fence. Say, oh, Pastor, it's too difficult. What is my family, my friends going to say? What about my job? None of that matters. Listen, if you're not willing to lose your job to be faithful to Jesus now, what makes you think that later you're going to be willing to lose your life? Jesus says, he who is faithful in the little will be faithful in the much. Jeremiah 12 verse 5 says, if you ran with men and you got tired, how do you think you're ever going to run with the horses? Jesus is saying, you know, it's like many Seventh-day Adventists that say, oh, Pastor, I just don't have enough money to tithe. Oh, I'd love to tithe, but I can't. I'll give you the secret. Where you'll always have enough money to tithe, do it first. You'll always have enough if you do it first. Oh, but Pastor, if I tithe, I'm not going to have enough to pay my bills. What makes you think that if you're not willing to return 10% to God, you're going to give it all up for him later? Now is the time we have to make decisions for God. Now is when we have to take a stand. And I pray to God that all of those who are present will take a stand and receive the seal of God and reject the mark of the beast. How about it? You want me to pray for you tonight? Father in heaven, we thank you for the clear message from your holy word. We now realize that the Christian church is going down the same road as ancient Israel. But I thank you that in ancient Israel you had a remnant who received the seal, and at the end of time you will have a remnant who keep your commandments and have the seal of God. I ask, Lord, that you will bless every person gathered here. Those who are in the valley of decision, I ask that your Holy Spirit will speak to their hearts and strengthen their decision to step out boldly and join your remnant people. I thank you, Lord, for hearing my prayer. For I ask it in Jesus' name. Amen.